Hi, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our second series of our ASEAN Series 2. Today, we'll talk about ASEAN Framework Agreement on Services and E-commerce. So today, we have a great lineup today. First, we'll start off with Mr. Ryan Kong from Enterprise Singapore, who will give us a brief overview of the ASEAN Framework Agreement on Services. And next, we'll also have Eugene Lim from Taxise Asia, who will talk about how businesses can tap onto the AFAS provision. And thirdly, we have Mr. Suan Teck Kin from UOB, who will give us an outlook of the digital economy and e-commerce ASEAN. Before handing it over to Ying from MTI, who will introduce us to the ASEAN Online Sales Day, an initiative by the ASEAN. And to summarize it all out, we will end off with a Q&A session. So if you have any questions, please feel free to keep them on the Q&A box. You will find the button at the bottom of your screen. And then we will address all the questions at the Q&A session at the end. So now I'll hand it over to Mr. Ryan Kong for his presentation. Ryan, please.
Hi, good morning. Can everyone see my slides?
Yes, Ryan, we can.
Okay. Yes, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning. My name is Ryan. I'm from Enterprise Singapore. I'll start today's session by taking us through kind of a broad overview of how services is covered in the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement. In particular, the ASEAN Framework Agreement on Services. Okay, then as we go along the way, please feel free to post your questions in the Q&A box. I'll just give you a kind of a broad overview and also dive into some of the details as to what is covered in the agreement. So first up, here's what we'll be looking at today. The AFAS for short, the ASEAN Framework Agreement on Services, and also briefly the upcoming ASEAN Trade and Services Agreement. And then we'll look at some of what are the frameworks that you can better understand how trade and services is conducted in an FTA, and some key principles of liberalization. Finally, just to give you a flavor of how services are covered in ASEAN member states' schedule of commitments. So first, the big picture, beyond ASEAN, if we look at Singapore's FTA network, right now we have a total of 27 agreements enforced, free trade agreements and economic partnership agreements with 65 trading partners around the world. As you can see, it's really quite a large spread. And of course, many of our key markets are covered thus far by our FTAs. Within ASEAN alone, we have multiple agreements, not just within the ASEAN framework, but also through things like what we call the ASEAN +1 agreements with a lot of our ASEAN dialogue partners, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, China, India, for example. But let's look at ASEAN today. What does the picture of services look like in ASEAN? Well, increasingly, this is an important sector in many ASEAN economies, accounting for an average of 50.6% of ASEAN GDP as of 2019. And in the case of Singapore, collectively, the ASEAN market is our third largest services trading partner. And this is an upward trend because increasingly, since over the past decade, you see that growing. Singapore services exports to ASEAN countries grew by 11.3% to 27.3 billion with the ASEAN region. This is in 2019, and this is ahead of both the US and mainland China, accounting for 10.7% of Singapore's total services exports. And as of 2020, in terms of also resident employment, the services sector accounts for more than 85%, which equates to about 1.89 million workers. So if we look at it in terms of the impact, it is quite significant for Singapore. Briefly, for what we'll look at now is the ASEAN Framework Agreement on Services. So some background. Basically, at the World Trade Organization back in the early 1990s, and in 1995, the world got together to come to agree on a framework agreement called the WTO General Agreement on Trade and Services, GATS for short, that provided the framework for liberalization. But along the way, towards early 2000s, there was a limit to how far the negotiations could go. And it was from then that countries started to do FTAs with one another, not least ASEAN. In ASEAN, I would say that even predates that, because technically ASEAN was our very first free trade area. Yeah. But the concept that is important to ASEAN is this concept called progressive liberalization. Because we recognize that while we are quite similar as a region, there are inherent diverse differences as well in terms of our development across the region. So a lot of it was looking at how integration could take place and as well as liberalization in a progressive manner. So in the case of the AFAS, this was through a series of 10 packages from 1997 all the way to 2018, of which AFAS 10 is the latest. Now, the idea of these packages is that incrementally, the ASEAN member states will be offering commitments to one another, and it gets better along the way. What I mean by commitments is whereby we agree to substantially eliminate discriminatory measures and market access limitations among ASEAN member states. And also in the process to prohibit new or more discriminatory measures and limitations. Okay, so the ASEAN Framework Agreement on Services covers services. Just a point to note that in the case of financial services and air transport services, those are negotiated under separate tracks by MAS and MOT. And from what I understand, presently they are on their 8th package. So that runs parallel. But in terms of specific commitments, those are addressed by those two competent authorities. Okay, so now I'll touch briefly on what is ATISA. You may have read about it in the news earlier this year. So basically, the ATISA builds on the integration of the AFAS. Okay, so the idea is that it will be the next lap of ASEAN services integration to go deeper into reducing, for example, beyond the border barriers for services suppliers. And again, the whole idea is that we want to create a more stable and predictable environment for trade and services and set that as the base, set the stage for further integration. The idea also is to work together to liberalize further in the process, how we can become a bit more integrated, and also to open up, I guess, hopefully, more opportunities for businesses. The status of the agreement thus far, okay, so how it works is that you have the signing of the agreement, so that has taken place, but each ASEAN member state has to basically undergo their domestic ratification processes. And to date, Singapore, Thailand, and Malaysia have completed their processes. The rest of the AMS are aiming to do so within this year. Okay, so the ATISA is kind of like the third pillar of both. You've heard of the ATIGA, I think for many of you here. That is the Trade in Goods Agreement. Then there's also the AKIA, which is the Comprehensive Investment Agreement. So services is, together with services, all these three pillars come together to help liberalize trade in the region. Run through some of the basic benefits of the ATISA and what it hopes to do. Basically, it is a binding legal agreement. Binding meaning there are hard obligations for liberalization. ATISA has referenced the GATS, but at the same time gone beyond that, to go deeper into providing greater commitments in terms of market access as well as domestic regulation. And I think the key feature here is that it sets a timeline for transition to a negative list. I'll explain this briefly. So basically, in negative list approach, the default is that all services sectors are committed, otherwise, not otherwise reserved by what we call a non-conforming measure. I'll give you some examples later to make it easier to understand. But the whole concept is that by default, things are liberalized unless you take a reservation. And this helps to foster transparency, greater transparency, and potentially can improve market access for businesses and service suppliers. In terms of the scope, it's intended to cover all services sectors. I'll illustrate with some examples later. Okay, so very quickly, to give you a deeper understanding of what trade in services covers. Just remember, these are the main three benefits that you can take away from today. Firstly, in the case of ASEAN member states, what we do is essentially offer preferential commitments to one another. Okay. In the process, the whole idea is that we want to ensure that we have a more predictable operating environment. Think of it as a form of, say, insurance protection that helps to prevent regimes and laws from changing to become more restrictive. And what it also does is to provide an opportunity for recourse should partners roll back on their trade commitments. So the key difference, if I compare services with goods, typically you look at things like tariff reduction or elimination, you look at things like rules of origin. For services, there's no equivalent concept. Services agreement doesn't say, for example, lower taxes and the like. But what it seeks to do is basically to make the environment, to make the businesses have a greater certainty when they trade and provide services to one another in each other's markets. So broadly, there are 12 main categories as to how services are covered. 160 subsectors captured within. This is largely a framework, a tool. But that's not to stop the ASEAN member states from going beyond and to list down what are some of the services that they hope to commit. So typically you understand services in the framework of modes of supply. I'll just touch on this briefly. I understand the next speaker is also going to cover this, but broadly they cover modes 1 to 4, meaning cross-border supply, consumption abroad, commercial presence, and the presence of natural persons. It's through these modes that services can be provided from one country to another. In the case of mode 1, the service moves. In the case of mode 2, the consumer moves. Mode 3 and 4 is where the commercial presence is established in market, or the natural person from one party is temporarily doing so in another party. This just for information, not to worry, to give you an idea of how services are captured in the trade agreements. Some of the basic rights that you get to enjoy, your company, your business gets to enjoy in market. I'll just go through 4 of them. First one is market access. So as the name suggests, market access refers to how open or how accessible the market is for your company. How is this captured in an agreement? Well, essentially, it looks to reduce limitations or barriers to market entry. So for example, a party commits not to impose limitations on the number of service suppliers or limitations on the total value of service transactions or assets, etc. What is more commonly seen are the latter three, whereby there may be limitations on the number of natural persons that may be employed in a particular service sector. Or if you are already operating in ASEAN, you'll be familiar that there are certain requirements in some of our ASEAN neighbors for specific types of legal entity or joint ventures, or limitation on the participation of foreign capital. So for example, say in Thailand, right, there may be a requirement for a Singapore company to hold only up to, say, 49% of foreign equity. So how does this work? So in the case of market access, what the AMS commit to is like, okay, if it's 49%, they need to make that transparent in the agreement, and they cannot along the way reduce it to, say, 40%. But it's possible for it to increase further along the way, say up to 60%. So the whole idea is that for market access, AMS commits to eliminate where possible, if not, then to reduce such barriers for businesses. National treatment. So essentially, national treatment refers to how level the playing field is. When a Singaporean enters in market, are we given a similar treatment to a local? So the term of art here is no less favorable than accorded to their own like services and service suppliers. Some examples is insofar as their nationality restrictions, say on or residency requirements or discriminatory type of licensing or limits imposed on foreign companies. Yeah, all these should be reduced. If it's not possible, at the minimum, they should be made known and committed that it should not become more restrictive. Domestic regulation. Now, in and of itself, domestic regulation is not wrong. In fact, all countries recognize that domestic regulation plays an integral role in ensuring the quality of a service, ensuring that things are operating smoothly. Yeah, you also want a case whereby you don't want anyone who claims to be a doctor, who claims to be an architect, to be able to just supply services in market. But the idea is that in and of themselves, they should not be a disguised restriction on trade. So what the AMS seek to do is basically to ensure in the AFAS, in the Taxise, that such services whereby the domestic regulation exists, these should be reasonable, objective, and impartial. Okay, so this applies to things like qualification requirements and procedures, technical standards, and licensing requirements. So, for example, when you talk about application procedures for licenses, there's some transparency in the process. There should be opportunities to correct mistakes, or there should be some kind of time frame whereby if an exam is held, it shouldn't be held conducted in an indefinite period of time, things like that. So the whole idea is to facilitate the flow of trade and services and to reduce restrictive restrictions. Transparency. Okay, so this is quite helpful because along the way, businesses also would like to know where can they find information. Sometimes not everything is so readily available. Yeah, so what the AMS commit to each other is that they, in terms of on their websites, in terms of their legislation, they should be promptly published all relevant measures of general application which pertain to trade and services. And if it's not possible, information should be made publicly available, and there should be contact points within the various governments or trade ministries to facilitate communications between the member states. Okay, now I'll just touch briefly on some of the services commitments. Yeah, so briefly what I covered in the first half of my presentation essentially is what are the disciplines found in the chapter. The next part looks at how, okay, in terms of the sectors covered, how are they scheduled? How do you read them? So earlier I mentioned positive and negative list approach. So the key difference is that right now the AFAS adopts a positive list approach, whereby at the outset, nothing is committed unless it's stated. So in this case, if you see in the schedule, okay, computer and related services, professional services, okay, that is what the ASEAN member state seeks to commit. Yeah. Of course, along the way, Taxise will provide a timeline for transition to negative list approach, but that will be sometime in the future, between 5, 7 to 13 years, depending on the development status of the ASEAN member state. Yeah, but I think always best to illustrate with a case example. So let's say your company would like to supply computer and related services to ASEAN markets. Okay, how would you like to do so? Well, you wish to do so cross-border via online means, as well as commercial presence with 100% foreign equity in market, and from time to time, if the situation permits, to be able to service clients in your markets. Now, of course, we recognize that in today's COVID world, there are some restrictions, but then again, if you're talking about online, all that is still possible. So essentially what FTA seek to do is to safeguard your company's interests. You recognize that I approach this example through the modes of supply, as I mentioned earlier. Yeah. So for those who are interested, I won't go too in depth on this, considering this is a general point. But when you look at the commitments, essentially, when a party puts there none in their schedule, it means that they will not impose any restrictions. When you see the word unbound, it means that, okay, there will be some restrictions, but they have no commitment in that particular sector. So for example, in Malaysia's schedule, if you're looking at computer and related services, digital services, what Malaysia is committed to is that, okay, they will not impose any limitations on market access for modes 1 to 3. they will not impose any limitations on national treatment for modes 1 to 3. So when you see something like that, it's generally good news. It means that the sector is fairly open to provide services. Yeah. 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 So in the case of movements of persons, of course, we are aware that there's been a lot going on in the news recently on this topic. I think the key to recognize is that, firstly, these address services supplied on a temporary basis, and it basically provides some possibilities for the temporary movement, in this case, for very specific categories of persons like inter-corporate transferees or specialists, but it's time-bound. So in this case, what Malaysia has allowed is up to 10 years for senior management and 3 specialists per organization, and for other short-term specialists or business visitors, up to 90 days. Yeah. I recognize that some of you may be interested, depending on your market of interest, depending on your service sector. Yeah. So I'll just briefly just show you what are some of the examples. Say in Indonesia, in this case, there are some limitations in this case on national treatment for mode 3 in terms of the foreign equity. Yeah. But by and large, cross-border is open. In terms of mode 4, some differences in the categories of persons committed, and also in terms of the length of stay. Yeah, but the whole idea is, as you see Thailand, as you see Vietnam, Philippines, all of them do commit to some form of liberalization. The key differences are, in this case, in terms of the foreign equity caps. I think for those operating in Thailand, you'll be very familiar with this. That's how they run their economy. Yeah, in terms of the length of stay as well. Yeah, so each ASEAN member state has basically the right to determine or to regulate the tenure and also the number of sectors that are committed. Yeah, but the spirit of it is that as we look at all these examples, increasingly they will allow foreign participation. Okay, yeah. So I guess depending on your sector of interest, depending on your modes of supply, depending on the market that you're interested in, all these examples can be found on our FTA website. In fact, everything you can access via our FTA website. Yeah, I put some links here, specific links for that may be relevant to your interests as well, on that references the ASEAN website. In this case, the AFAS commitments. So I hope that helps. Just to give you a very brief overview as well as some details on what to expect when it comes to services in ASEAN. Yeah, thank you very much. I hope you enjoy the rest of the presentations. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. So next we have Mr. Eugene Lim. Eugene, please.
Good morning, everyone. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Eugene Lim, and I'm a principal and co-founder of Taxise Asia. And we are a boutique international tax, international trade and transfer pricing law firm here in Singapore. And today, very, very pleased to share with you on how businesses can benefit from the ASEAN Framework Agreement on Services. So my presentation will be split into 3 sections. I'll first start with a very brief introduction to AFAS, but I know the previous speaker, Ryan, has actually gone through quite a bit of history around AFAS and how it will transition to TISA. I'll then provide examples of different modes of service supply. And thirdly, I'll give some examples as to how AFAS can benefit businesses. So I think in terms of the AFAS history, AFAS has been around for a very long time. It was first signed in 1995. And the various ASEAN countries then proceeded to negotiate and sign packages of commitments. And to date, there are about 10 packages of commitments although as Ryan has mentioned, for finance and maritime services, there are, or transportation services, there are slightly different timelines to the negotiation of the packages. Each of these packages have a lot of substantive negotiations, and a lot of material and documents have been created as a result. And it covers a very wide range of sectors. But really, I guess the question is, how can companies access these benefits? And really, the devil is in the details. I think to understand the benefits of AFAS is important to look at the very specific set of rules as to how AFAS affects each of the different service sectors. I think Ryan has spoken about some of the general principles, and what I'll do in the third section of my discussion is to look at specific examples of how AFAS could affect business behavior and business conduct in the various countries. So I know Ryan had spoken about the different modes of service supply. I'll just give a bit more detail to the different types of modes of service supply. And essentially, when we think about trade and services, we're looking at 4 different modes of service supply. The cross-border mode of service supply, consumption abroad, commercial presence, and provision of services through the presence of natural persons. So when we look at cross-border supplies, we're really dealing with a situation where a service supplier in a foreign country is able to provide services to service recipients in the domestic market. So for example, if we have a service supplier here in Singapore, let's say it's a consulting service, a consultant, let's say someone like me, and I've got a client, say in Indonesia, and they call me, or we could correspond over the internet or via email, and I'm providing legal advice to them. That would be an example of a cross-border supply, whereby I'm sitting here in Singapore, but the service recipient is in an overseas country, and I'm providing that service without leaving Singapore. Then you have consumption abroad. And every one of us, I think, would have consumed services abroad at some point in time. And good examples of services that are consumed abroad would include tourism services, where essentially a person in the country goes overseas to enjoy a service. So it could be tourism. I think for a lot of young people who have studied abroad, education services can also be provided and consumed overseas. Likewise, I think for countries like Singapore, like Thailand, where there's a lot of medical tourism, there again, you've got examples of consumption abroad where foreigners would travel to either Singapore or Thailand to receive medical services. Thirdly, commercial presence. This is a situation where a foreign investor now sets up a commercial presence in the domestic market in order to provide services to that market. So this would be setting up, for example, a subsidiary. So a Singapore company setting up a subsidiary in Malaysia in order to provide services to the Malaysian market. Or it could be a Singapore bank setting up a branch, say in Myanmar, in order to provide banking services to consumers in Myanmar. The provision of services through natural persons, this would typically apply where, for example, I in Singapore, if I decide to travel to, let's say, Thailand in order to meet a client to provide legal services, that would be an example of presence of natural persons abroad, whereby I'm physically traveling to another country in order to provide the service to that different country. And you see a lot of this, either consultants going overseas to provide consulting services, surveyors engaged by construction companies to inspect overseas property. It could be doctors that travel overseas to provide medical services. So those are examples of mode 4, supply of services. Okay, so all this is theory. how do businesses actually benefit from AFAS? And I've provided a few examples here. The first would be preferential market access under the commercial presence mode of service. So I think Ryan had touched on this. But when we look at AFAS, there are several ways in which we can look at AFAS. One way would be to say, well, how do I invest in a way that guarantees the level of investment so that there is no quote-unquote rollback of those commitments at a later point in time? But where we're looking at preferential market access, we're actually saying, are there situations where AFAS provides a better result than what is available to non-ASEAN service providers? And here really, I think you need to have a very, very close review of the different sectors which you're interested in and compare the sector commitments by the particular country to their existing laws. And here, for example, we looked at healthcare in Thailand. And today, a foreign shareholder is only restricted to 49% equity in a investment in a Thai healthcare company. Now, under AFAS, that 49% shareholding requirement is increased to 70% shareholding. So that gives you a benefit over non-ASEAN service providers or investors setting up a healthcare company in Thailand. So in this situation, if you look at the AFAS schedules and you compare that to what domestic law says in terms of shareholding restrictions, there really is an advantage for ASEAN investors to use AFAS as a method of investment into Thailand and the healthcare sector. Now let's look at another example. Let's look at recruitment. Now, mutual recognition agreements aren't quite part of AFAS, but I think it's important to speak about mutual recognition agreements when we talk about cross-border or the mode for service through the presence of natural persons. When you are looking at the provision of services overseas, and there are going to be rules about employment of foreigners, etc., it's also important to look at mutual recognition agreements. And there are a series of mutual recognition agreements that have been signed under the ASEAN Economic Community Framework. And that sits alongside with AFAS in terms of the cross-border movement of natural persons. But when I'm looking at, for example, recruitment of talent, and whilst I think Ryan has mentioned that AFAS deals with temporary movement of persons across borders, apart from my ability to move across borders on a temporary basis, if, for example, a business is looking to hire talent and looking at, going beyond Singapore shores, or looking at deploying staff in overseas ASEAN countries, then looking at the mutual recognition agreements that have been signed among the ASEAN countries will be important to ensure that you're able to have foreign degrees being recognized in the local markets for purposes of professional qualification and accreditation. Okay, this is another example which I think is useful that talks to rollbacks. And I think there are very few companies that actually think about rollbacks of market access commitments. But I think it will become more important, especially as businesses start to provide services across borders through digital means. So the digital economy has grown significantly. And today there is a very significant part of the economy that provides services across borders digitally. And when you're dealing with the digital economy, essentially you are providing services from one country through digital means to many countries overseas without actually having a presence. So for example, If you have an e-commerce website, you would have perhaps a digital web hosting service provider that you contract with. It could be GoDaddy, it could be Azure, it could be whichever company you deal with. You could be contracting with them in Singapore, but that by maintaining that website, that web portal, you're now able to provide services to multiple countries. And I think the digital economy is going to be where potentially countries will look to roll back commitments. And so I've given an example of teleconferencing services. Now, what's interesting in the AFAS schedule of commitments is that when AFAS was first negotiated, and indeed when the classifications were first designed, this was in the 1990s, early 2000s, at a time when perhaps the digital economy was not quite as pronounced. But today, for example, teleconferencing services, how that service is provided is going to be very different from when it was first conceived under the classifications. But nevertheless, there is a definitional issue as to what consists of teleconferencing services. But let's assume, for example, you're in Singapore and you have a service where you provide the ability for your customers to provide teleconferencing, video conferencing services online. And you have a whole range of customers globally. And it could be in Indonesia, for example, in this, and I've used Indonesia just for reference. Now, under AFAS, Indonesia has committed to removing market access limitations for teleconferencing services. So Indonesia has essentially said in the AFAS framework that it will not impose any market access restrictions to the ability for an ASEAN service provider to provide teleconferencing services to Indonesian consumers from overseas. Now, under the WTO GATS agreement, so Ryan talked about the General Agreement on Trade and Services, Indonesia has not committed to removing any market access limitations for teleconferencing services. So in effect, because the GATS agreement takes a positive list approach, by not listing this particular sector and making any commitments, Indonesia is saying that we have not made any commitments to remove any market access limitations. So let's say, for example, today you have two companies, a US company and a Singapore company, providing competing teleconferencing services, and they have some customers in Indonesia. And if Indonesia then decides to pass a law restricting the ability of overseas teleconferencing service providers from providing teleconferencing services, or requiring the overseas service provider to set up a local entity in Indonesia to do so. In this scenario, for ASEAN service providers that rely on AFAS, they then are able to avail themselves to the certainty of their existing operations, because their ability to provide cross-border teleconferencing services to Indonesian consumers is protected under the AFAS agreement. However, for non-ASEAN service providers, so for example, the US service provider in our example, they would not have the same protection because the GATS agreement does not deal with this particular industry. And as a result, they may have to change their business model in order to comply with the Indonesian rules. So those are sort of the three examples that I'd like to discuss about how AFAS could benefit businesses. But I'll just like to end off by saying that when companies look at doing business beyond our shores, there are other issues that you may want to take in consideration. For example, the availability of investment protection under other free trade agreements, or under bilateral investment treaties. So I think Ryan mentioned the ASEAN Comprehensive Investment Agreement, and there are other bilateral investment treaties that provide protection. Now, no one actually thinks about investment treaties and investment protection until something goes wrong. But I think when you're investing in emerging markets, and there are a lot of emerging markets in our region, it's important to look at investment treaties because when you need it, you want to ensure it's there for you to rely upon, rather than finding out that the investment could have been structured differently in order to avail yourself of investment protection when that was not done in the beginning of the process. Secondly, to look at double tax treaties or double tax agreements. And there again, Singapore has a relatively business-friendly tax environment, but the same is not true for a lot of countries in ASEAN. And here, looking at the various double tax agreements and looking at what benefits can be derived could help to make that cross-border investment more efficient. And thirdly, to look at the availability of incentives, tax incentives or otherwise, in order to ensure that you're better able to run your business in a more efficient manner. And finally, there are a whole host of other considerations when you're dealing with doing business on a cross-border basis. For example, selection of choice of law, etc. But when you're looking at investing overseas, I'll just leave you with the final thought that beyond just looking at AFAS, there are a whole range of other issues that should be considered holistically. So with that, that brings me to the end of my presentation, and I'll hand it back to, I'll hand it to Mr. Suan. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Eugene. Ivy, should I start?
Yes, Mr. Suan.
Okay, sure. All right, hope everything is sound is clear and can hear me well. All right, thanks, Eugene. And let me share my screen here for you. Hello, good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here, and thanks SBF for having me here today to share some of the thoughts and views from us over at the UOB research team. My name is Suan Teck Kin. I'm with the UOB research team, head of research at UOB, and our website is in the QR code. Now QR code is very popular, so I also have one for you to scan to go to our website to take a look at the information that we provide over at the research team, especially on information in ASEAN, which I think the previous speakers, Ryan and Eugene, talk a lot about the ASEAN. Okay, so today I would like to share with you. I'm the only the only two non-public speakers or government speakers here. So from a business perspective, why should we be looking at ASEAN? And also, what are the things that we look out for when we talk about digital economy, which Eugene mentioned just now? All right, the e-commerce space and what kind of potential. Okay, so for the next 20 minutes or so, I will just do that. Okay, I'll have 3 points to share with you. One is, okay, I think a bit of, okay, in the ASEAN, why should we be looking at ASEAN despite the, the short-term, all the issues that we are facing right now with the COVID-19 situation among the countries? And we should be looking at on a more medium-term to long-term perspective. Right, and I will show you some of the fundamentals that we should be focusing on, rather than the COVID situation that is the main preoccupation right now. And also beyond this pandemic, what else can we look forward to specifically for ASEAN? What kind of size are we talking about here? We know that size is huge, and what are some of the things that we can, some of the numbers that we can expect. And also finally, in terms of the e-commerce space, specifically for the retail business, what are some of the things that we can take away, looking at the specific examples of Singapore? And that will give us hopefully some inspiration or some idea of what we should be looking at. All right, okay. Right, short-term and long-term view or medium-term view for ASEAN. All right, the short-term view is this. The situation in ASEAN, obviously, just like many parts of the world, the not so rich parts of the world, that these virus and the variants and also vaccines are all the three things that are the main drivers for basically the business outlook. Okay, you have Malaysia and Indonesia yesterday, government coming out to say that, oh, our forecast this year may have to, our growth forecast for the year may have to be tuned down, may have to be lowered because of the COVID situation in their countries. Okay, so we have this sort of a situation down there, solely driven by the title on the screen, the virus, the variants, the Delta variant, and also the vaccination process. If you take a look at the colorful charts on the screen, you take a look at a colorful chart on the screen, you can see the green is more or less good comparatively, and then the red not so good, just like passing marks like that. Green means you pass kind of thing, and red not so good. So you can see that for instance, in terms of vaccination, some of the richer countries you can see the names. The vaccination progress is very good. High percentage of the population being vaccinated, so the chances of them being infected are lower. The chances of getting severe illness from the COVID-19 also lower. So you can see that the UK, the US, the Eurozone making very good progress. But once you go down the list where the ASEAN countries, the Asian countries are, except for Singapore, not so great, right? The vaccination rate is typically very poor. For example, in Vietnam, it's about 0.2% of the population compared to Singapore is 37, right? We are going to get even larger number by end of this month. Okay, Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, that's those kind of those countries, because the supplies are limited. And then you can see that new cases and also let's say new death, daily new cases. These are the daily new cases reported by WHO. You can see again that the yellow and the reds not so good in these countries, right? So get more infections. For instance, Thailand 6,000, 7,000 cases, Malaysia 8,000 cases, Indonesia, I think the latest number is like close to 40,000 new cases in the latest increase. All right. Similarly for the death cases as well, the mortality rate also very high because of the low vaccination. So then the problem is that this situation is going to be with us for a little while. Is it going to be for too long? We don't know how long it's going to be, but it's going to be with us for a while. Just like the weather that we have today, it's going to be rainy and gloomy for a day, maybe for two. But is it going to be for long? I don't think it's going to be for long, right? It's going to sort itself out in terms of, let's say, getting more vaccine supplies into the country. In let's say Thailand and other places, and increase the vaccination rate. So the situation should improve after a certain time. And then when that time comes, as we move forward, that is where the medium-term fundamentals will exert themselves. I will share with you some of these medium-term fundamentals later. But if you can take a look at these are so-called our growth projections, growth projections for the year. Most of the countries down at the bottom are the ASEAN countries, for instance, Vietnam, Thailand, and all these places. We look at, our base case, let's say the virus situation is not getting worse, or the cases are under control. Okay, what are the base case? And then we have a pessimistic. You can look at take a look at the right-hand side here. The more pessimistic cases are that if the situation is not under control, continue to persist for another quarter. This quarter, third quarter, we are in July already, second half of the year. So third quarter continue to persist. Third quarter, what will happen to their growth prospects? Right, you can see that, for instance, Thailand could end up in a no growth environment for the entire. And last year, remember, Thailand was already down 6.6%, right? Declined by 6.6% already. Just a business, your revenue already down. And this year, the prospects, the possibility, because of the COVID situation in Thailand, for Thailand economy itself could be stuck at the zero, no growth situation. So similarly to others. So we look at the range of pessimistic scenario. Most of them we're going to see the growth to be slower for 2021. Hopefully, there's some pickup in 2022 once the vaccination comes in, once the situation gets under control. Yeah, so that is the short term. This year, next year. So should we just say that we look at the situation, or forget about this place? We are go elsewhere to do business. But my argument is that I think we should continue to look at ASEAN. Just like Ryan mentioned earlier, ASEAN represents our third largest source of market, third largest market in terms of services, right? So it's still an important market for us. The important market for us, so we need to continue to pay attention to this place. And in fact, I think there are opportunities in this recessionary kind of condition, not so positive kind of outlook. Actually, there's still opportunities. I will share with you later with some of the specific examples, right? So fundamentally for ASEAN, why we should be paying attention, there are a couple of things I'd like to point out, that these factors will not go away because of the pandemic. They will still be here. Once the pandemic is over, the fundamentals, these are the fundamentals on the screen that you're seeing, will start to exert themselves. It's kind of like a company, share price is down, but the company fundamentals are good. So the share price is down means opportunity to accumulate rather than to sell, right? So similarly for ASEAN, what are the positive fundamentals that we can rely on? One of the things is demographics, right? Demographics in terms of headcount, in terms of number of people, in terms of headcount, ASEAN is the third largest in the world, right? By 2030, I think the projection from United Nations is that it's still going to be the third largest place in the world with large population, the third largest population in the world, 2030, 2040. I'm just showing you 2030 as an example. This is only after India and China. So where else are we going to get a place with a large population? When you have large population, means the market size will be larger, right? Will be larger compared to some place like, for instance, Singapore population so small. What else can you do here, right? After a certain point, you'll reach a saturation that you need to go somewhere else. And ASEAN is right in our neighborhood, right? It's right in our neighborhood that we can do something about this place. Okay, so this is something that is good, large population. Then the other thing of importance is our population here in ASEAN in aggregate is a young population. More than half of the population, is a young population. That means 34 years old, 35 years old and below. So there are two advantages, at least two advantages that I can see. One is that the young population means your labor force size is much larger. Second advantage I can see, of course, is a lot of upside. Upside. Eat too much at McDonald's. A lot of upside for this income growth and also for consumer demand. If you are into consumer business, you want to go to a place, large number of people, head count, and you want to make sure that these people are richer by the day and not poorer by the day, right? So you want to go to a place where there's an income potential. That's where ASEAN is. So you can see that the numbers here is about more than 50%. And then also these individual countries, there's some that are much younger. For instance, Indonesia is younger than the average of ASEAN. Even if you talk about going into 2030, right, going beyond this year, still continue to be young and therefore providing you with a dynamism. And then Malaysia as well, all these sizable markets, including Vietnam, sizable markets are large, young population, very important. And of course, the extreme example is Singapore. Right, Singapore, the young population shrinking, so we are facing an aging population. And also, of course, the other day, in Parliament, the discussion, just how Ryan also alluded to, the discussion on FTA and also on the requirement for foreign workers to supplement our local force. And this situation can only get more acute for us as the population ages and more people retire. All right, so the demand for our workforce will be very different, and also your market size will also change, right? Your market preferences. Okay, so these are examples. And the other, just continuing the discussion on young population and huge potential. You can take a look at our potential here in terms of middle class population. If you are in the consumer market, you want, especially in the even in the professional market or consumer market, you want a population that's getting richer, right? According to the projections here from ASEAN, US ASEAN Center, the proportion of the middle class population in ASEAN is going to more, 3 times the size by 2030, right? By 2030, it's going to be 3 times the size in terms of the proportion. From 15% today, the middle class consumers in ASEAN, 600-700 million of them, 46% of them will be the middle class consumers. So that's very significant. And this is the same path that we are traveling with China as well. And you can see that the consumer market, now the retail sales is about the same size as the US to become the world's largest retail sales market in China. So there's a lot of potential for ASEAN. Then the other thing, of course, is the base itself, the economy, the base of the economy in ASEAN, population, income, and then now the size of the economy is also, in terms of size, is the number 5, number 6 in the world. All right, and 2025, the projection again, I think it's going to be maintaining the size of number 5, number 6 largest economy in the world. And India is just a bit nearby, right? India a bit nearby. So that's the kind of size advantage that we have in ASEAN. And as a result of this, I think a lot of foreign investors over the years also notice this sort of trend. So the inflows from foreign investors, and we talked just now, Eugene also talked about, and Ryan talked about this services agreement to protect foreign investors going to those countries, and precisely because these foreign investors also want protection. If they feel comfortable, they feel protected, there's a market size, they will continue to come in. And you take a look at the picture here, ASEAN is the world's number 3 destination in terms of attracting foreign investments. Right, these are the FDI, foreign direct investment. These are the real investments: set up factories, set up shops, set up offices, set up all sort of other services, right, into the country. It's number 3 after China and US. All right. So, and despite that's 2020 numbers. That's despite the COVID situation. Foreign investors continue to go into this part of the world, which is good news. All right, which is good news. You don't want to be a place where people don't want to come. Right, people don't want to invest. Okay, so that is for us in Singapore. This is our neighborhood. People are willing to come in to invest in the various countries. All right. Okay, so that is the fundamentals. I think likely to exert themselves or continue to exert themselves. All right. I'm going to move beyond that. Talk briefly about the digital economy. Okay, the size of the digital economy in ASEAN. We don't have statistics. We don't do our own statistics, but we rely on these statistics from this Google Temasek report. I'm sure many of you, at least some of you, have come across this Google Temasek report on the digital economy in ASEAN. The link is down here. I think there should be a link here that you can go take a look at. The title is Economy Southeast Asia 2020. This is the latest edition. They have published a few edition. The latest one actually upgraded the size of the ASEAN economy, right? The size of the ASEAN digital economy, because of the COVID situation that really, I think, created very favorable conditions for the expansion of this digital economy. And the expectation is that is going to projection 2025 is going to triple the size in terms of the value, from 100 over billion to 300 over billion, right? It's going to triple the size in the next few years. So what are these digital economy services like online travel, transport, e-commerce, the light of the Lazada and all these things at the consumer market. So this is the overall size based on the Google and Temasek report, that is going to triple. In terms of the ASEAN GDP, just now, remember I mentioned ASEAN is the 6th largest in the world. In terms of the share of GDP, it's not, here in this case, it's not triple. Here in this case, it's not triple. Why is that the case? It's not triple? That's because the ASEAN economy is growing even faster, right? That's the reason why the share is not triple. It's only here about just about double the share. All right. So this is the kind of momentum and dynamics that we are talking about in the digital economy space in ASEAN. Because of the fundamentals, will start to exert themselves. All right. And if you look down, according to this Temasek report, Google Temasek report, if you look down into the breakdowns of different countries, the dynamics are different for different countries depending on the population size, the income growth, and other factors. You know, the internet coverage, mobile phone coverage, etc. So you can see that being a large population with large population size, Indonesia on the screen here at the near here has the largest potential because of the population size advantage, right? And also the young age of the population. You adopt technology faster. You are going to willing to spend all these online what do you call that, internet tribes, you know, online internet people willing to spend time online is more, the tendency is more. So you can see that the growth is substantial in Indonesia, and also the size in terms of the volume, the dollar value, much bigger in Indonesia. And the other one of note is Thailand, and also here we have Vietnam as well, right? Vietnam, 100 million population, Thailand roughly around 60-80 million population. Also very high adoption rate, right? Malaysia, not so much in terms of the dollar value, but in terms of the growth is roughly about the same, right? Roughly about the same with many of these ASEAN neighbors. Okay, so that's where the momentum and also the dynamics will come from different countries. So there's a lot of opportunities for us in this part of the world. All right. So for the next few minutes, I will share a bit on with this digital economy in the background, right? The digital economy in the background, and also the fundamentals coming in to exert themselves. What are the things that we can take away from? I use an example in Singapore. What are the examples can take away specifically for the retail sales sector, for the retail sector? I think these examples, subsequent examples, I think should set us thinking. I think should apply across other ASEAN economies as well. All right, let's take a look Singapore, where we can see that there's a shift in consumer behavior partly because of the pandemic. All right, okay, let's take a look. Okay, right. Okay, here. This is okay, this is Singapore retail sales. This is Singapore retail sales. You can see that in terms of the share of online versus offline, the share of online. Okay, the share of online retail sales. That means our Singapore retail sales, part of it is done in stores physically, part of it is done online. Be it supermarkets, be it computer products, be it even food and F&B delivered online, purchase online, delivered to you by all these Grab and other providers, right? You can see that the share before COVID situation, 2018, 2019, the average of the online sales is only about 5%, 5% only. And because of the pandemic, no choice, everybody stuck at home. The circuit breaker, April and June, the proportion jumped all the way to 25%. Okay, because we are stuck at home, right? Only essential goods at the time. Last year, if you remember, only essential goods like supermarkets, you can do it physically, but otherwise, other retail stores are closed. So you can see that the proportion jumped, but after the circuit breaker was lifted, then the proportion of online sales dropped. But you notice the difference here, the drop hasn't dropped back to before COVID, right? Before pandemic, it hasn't dropped back to before at 5%. And now hovering at 12% on average since then, right? Since June last year until now. The average is about 12%. The latest number in May is 14%. So it fluctuates because of the heightened alert. People again stuck at home, right? For most of the time, and work from home as default and all that. So you can see that the number did not drop below or before to the pre-pandemic level. So there's a shift in consumer behavior because of the pandemic And so once people behavior change, the habits change, it's kind of like stuck at certain level. So I think this will apply again to other countries as well, right? Especially for those that are under very difficult situations like Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, Vietnam also. So the numbers will be disproportionately higher than compared to before. Okay, so so that's the situation. The shift in consumer behavior will not take into account. More of it is done online, right? More of the retail sales done online. All right. So how about this year? You can see that in terms of the value, our retail sales value in Singapore every month, this is a monthly number. You can see that the monthly number fluctuates around 3 to 4 billion a month, except this pandemic period, roughly around 3 to 4 billion. And you also can see that there's a peak. Every time there's a peak around December time, January time, December time. December is more obvious because of seasonal demand, Christmas, people tend to shop a lot more. The numbers just jump in these months. But the online portion, just now I show you the share, right? You can see the online portion, the numbers are even more staggering in terms of the change. $175 million in 2018 per that month, 170 January 2018. But now the latest number is 400 over million, 3 times the increase in terms of the sales volume done online. But your total retail sales remain about the same, did not go up. In fact, actually dropped. That means the proportion has gone up, right? Online sales have gone up. That means taking away the sales from the online store, the physical store, right? The online is taking away sales. So this is something that we should take away. But so that's what we call digital disruption. Finally, I just want to share with you, is it the same for all services, all types of sales? No, it's not. It's not the same. The proportion, this is a proportion of sales done online for various segments. You can see that for these naturally native digital sort of products, computer, equipment, phone, right? The proportion is 54% for the latest month. In January, it's only 26%, 1/4. Now, half of it is done online. And in April, before the COVID heightened alert, is already close to 50%. So this is something that I think we should take note. Very high proportion. So quite challenging for those stores that specialize in this physical presence. Yeah. For example, last year I bought computers, even iPhone online because I was at home stuck. Now will I do it again? Actually, I did again. Bought phones online for my wife and my children online as well. So this is the kind of a behavior change. But other things as well, same. Furniture, household equipment, appliances and stuff like that, done online. The proportion gone up, and also even F&B. Can you imagine F&B? You want to consume in store, but not so much now because of pandemic, because of the change in behavior, proportion larger. And finally, the only thing that is quite stable, right? Quite stable is the supermarket sales. So people still prefer to visit the physical stores, right? The proportion is less compared to others, but still, you're talking about 10% versus 7%, 8% before that. So 8 to 10% done online for the supermarket. So there's still a lot of opportunity for the supermarkets in terms of their physical presence. That's the reason why I think Sheng Siong has done such a good job, such a good business last year, that giving away a double-digit bonus to the staff, right? So that is all reflective in these numbers. Right. Finally, I just want to share with you here in terms of the total. Just now we saw Singapore is about 10 earlier, I can't remember, 14%. But in China, the proportion is already 30% of the sales done online. 30%. So we can take away all these and apply to our neighbors, right? To even in Singapore, our number, is it going to go higher? I think chances are likely to go higher, and opportunities as well for our neighboring countries to go higher in terms of proportion as well. All right. So these are some of the takeaways that I think will be useful for you as you plan for your business ventures, or you rethink your strategy and things like that. All right, so this deck will be available to you if you would like to receive these taxes approach SBF. I'll stop my sharing for now. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think next now we'll move on to Ying, who will also talk about one of the ASEAN initiative for e-commerce. Ying, please.
Hi, thanks everyone. Thanks Nicole. I'm Ying from the Ministry of Trade Industries ASEAN Division. Hope everyone can see my slides and hear me well. And it's really my pleasure to present at this webinar following this. Oh, sorry, I realized my video is not on. Yeah, okay, so sorry for that. Yeah, so it's a pleasure to present at this webinar following the insightful sessions of the great speakers before me, and I would like to thank SBF for putting this together. And as Mr. Suan mentioned, thanks to everyone who is dialing into this on this Tuesday morning when it's very rainy and very comfortable to sleep in. So without further ado, I'll just go straight into my presentation. So earlier, Mr. Suan presented on the outlook of the digital economy and e-commerce in the region. And we are all in agreement that the region's digital potential is really very positive and bright, and there are a lot of opportunities for companies to assess the region's markets and ride on regional economic and digital growth. So to do precisely that, ASEAN has put in place, or at least what we are discussing at ASEAN among the different ministries of trade industries, is that we have put in place various initiatives to promote e-commerce in the region. And I'll be focusing on one of them in my presentation today, which is the ASEAN Online Sale Day. And this is an initiative jointly brought to you by MTI in partnership with SBF. So what is the AOSD? So that's what we call it, the ASEAN Online Sale Day, AOSD. So some businesses here may already be familiar with the AOSD or even participated in the inaugural run last year. But for the benefit of everyone, I'll just go through the genesis and background of the AOSD. So the AOSD was conceptualized in January last year. So this was actually prior to the onset of the pandemic in the region actually, so January 2020. And therefore, as the impact of the pandemic gradually became more widespread, we realized that the AOSD could be a good idea to help to reinforce e-commerce adoption in the region, especially in support of businesses that had to digitalize their operations and start selling online. Therefore, the inaugural AOSD was held on 8 August 2020, which is a very auspicious date. 8 August is also ASEAN Day, the day on which ASEAN was founded in 1967. The turnout for the first AOSD was also quite positive, with more than 200 businesses participating in the AOSD last year. And in fact, 95 of the businesses were based in Singapore. So 95 out of 200, that's almost half of all participating businesses that were based in Singapore. And this good showing is also testament to the potential of the regional e-commerce market for Singapore's businesses. Yep, so moving on to how does the AOSD work? So how the AOSD works is that businesses will register with the relevant agency of the ASEAN country they are based in. So for Singapore, that would be the Ministry of Trade Industry, MTI, and we're working together with SBF on this. Businesses will be given the official AOSD logo after they register, and they'll be able to display the AOSD logo on their online websites and are free to put together publicity or marketing collaterals to increase the publicity for their website. And businesses will also be featured on the official AOSD website, and the link is on the slide here. I encourage everyone to check it out. So onlineasean.com, and the website is currently live, so you can check it out right now. The website lists businesses by their sales to the country. So you see on the left-hand side of the slide, there's an example, there's a snapshot of the website that shows the different the icons of the countries that are participating. So all 10 ASEAN member states are participating in the ASEAN Online Sale Day. And just to give an example of how the website works, so as a consumer in Singapore myself, I would select Singapore, and the website will show me all the businesses that are selling items to Singapore. Similarly, if I were a business that is offering shipping to Indonesia, Singapore, and Vietnam, so these 3 countries, for example, my business will be included in the Indonesia, Singapore, and Vietnam tabs. So for example, an Indonesian consumer will be able to see my business under the Indonesia tab. And therefore, consumers in all the relevant countries will be able to view my business. And from there, they can easily access different websites to browse the items being sold. Currently, respective countries are progressively updating the website, and they will be uploading the list of businesses registered for the AOSD. And just wanted to explain that actually this is a free platform and there'll be no charges to participate in the AOSD. Finally, to support businesses' publicity, there will also be regional marketing efforts, such as via social media and also official online announcements on ASEAN's website. And just to highlight also additionally, last week, MTI and SBF have also released social media posts for businesses' information and registration. And MTI will also be releasing another post on social media this afternoon, so do look out for it. Now I'll move on to why businesses should participate in AOSD, drawing on feedback from last year's run. So these are just some statistics that we gathered from feedback on last year's iteration. So from our survey of last year's participants, the key benefits of the AOSD is greater brand awareness and exposure to the region's e-commerce market and consumers. So slightly more than half of respondents reported that the AOSD boosted their exposure to ASEAN's consumers, which also contributed to increased web traffic. And 37% of respondents also conducted cross-border sales to consumers in other ASEAN markets. Overall, 81% of respondents confirmed that they will be interested to participate in the next iteration of the AOSD, which is taking place this year. And we are quite heartened by these results and are keen to continue improving the event for businesses to expand their reach to the region. So leveraging last year's feedback, we've also conveyed the feedback to our other ASEAN counterparts, and we're now working together to really enhance the AOSD for the benefit of businesses. For example, there was some feedback last year that one day, that is 8 August, may be too short, especially since there are some B2B platforms that target businesses that operate on weekdays. So just for context, last year, 8 August fell on a Saturday, so that was a weekend. So that may be good for consumers who are at home and are browsing online, but then for businesses, in terms of B2B platforms that sell to businesses, this may not be ideal. So as such, this year's iteration has been extended to last over 3 days from 8 to 10 August 2021. The AOSD website, as mentioned on onlineasean.com, has also been enhanced to allow for better filtering and easier use for consumers. So businesses, during registration, you can now select categories during registration, such as apparel, consumer electronics, or furniture. And these can be easily viewed and filtered by consumers. So for example, if you were a consumer who were looking for consumer electronics, you can just click that filter and then you'll be able to see all the businesses that are offering consumer electronics. So that's just some examples of how the website is being enhanced this year for better consumer experience and also for businesses as well. Additionally, there will also be regional marketing efforts, as mentioned, to increase the publicity of businesses. Registered businesses may also have an opportunity to be featured on these channels. So there are some examples on the slide here. Some recent social media posts by the ASEAN Secretariat, who is promoting the regional social market campaign. And ASEAN businesses who have registered with their agencies will also have an opportunity to be featured on these channels. So if you're interested, please feel free to let us or SBF know. Yep, so these are just some examples of how we are working to enhance the AOSD for the benefit of businesses and consumers this year. And finally, we then move on to the last step. How can businesses register for AOSD 2021? The process is quite simple. If you're a Singapore-based business or marketplace, just go to the website, tinyurl.com/AOSDreg, which is on the slide. You can just go to this website and fill out the online registration form. And you will thereafter receive a confirmation email on your participation and the official AOSD logos for display on your websites as well. And we also encourage participating businesses to use ASEAN-related discount codes such as ASEAN 10 or ARC 2021. Of course, the amount of the discount will be entirely up to you to set. And after the event, there will also be a post-event questionnaire to provide feedback on the event. And we look forward to receiving the feedback of participants so that we can continue improving and enhancing future iterations for businesses and consumers. And actually, that's all I have. And I hope businesses found this useful, and feel free to contact SBF if you have any questions on registration or participation. Thanks very much. And I'll pass it back to Ivy. Thanks, Ivy.
Thank you, Ying. Thank you to all the speakers. May I invite all of you back to the floor for the Q&A session. We will be also launching the end of the webinar poll. So we will appreciate if all the attendees can assist to fill it up so we can further improve our webinars. Without any further ado, I shall start the Q&A section. Maybe I shall address the, thank you very much for receiving all the questions, for sending the questions. We do receive quite a number. Maybe I shall address the first question to Ryan first. Ryan, there's a question whereby the participant is asking that who or where actually the company can approach if they face issues on the commitments, if the commitments in the FTA are violated.
Hi, yeah, thanks, Ivy. Yeah, I understand that this question is from Ms. Alani. I understand that she also has a follow-up question with regards to whether all FTAs that Singapore has signed, do they contain trade and services? So since it's from her, I'll address these two questions together.
Thank you, Ryan.
Yeah, so to address question one first, who can companies approach if they face issues if commitments in the FTAs are violated? Well, there are multiple routes to take. I think first and foremost, even Enterprise Singapore, Singapore Business Federation, the Ministry of Trade and Industry, we're all available. Very happy if you can just write into us if you want to elaborate further on what are some of the issues that we are facing. I think first we also want to determine whether there is indeed some kind of violation in the FTAs. Yeah, but happy to, if you are asking this question because right now you are facing some issues, potential violations, please reach out to us. Yeah, MTI, SBF, and ESG. Alternatively, I think we also have organizations like, for example, Eugene's, their law firms, and many of them will be able to provide also legal opinions, especially when we are talking about whether there are any contraventions of FTA regulations. Yeah, so all these are possibilities. So I guess it's ultimately dependent on how much escalation your company would like to raise this to. With regards to your second question, the answer is yes, the vast majority of our FTAs now to date contains references to trade and services or has a standalone trade and services chapter. For some of our ASEAN agreements, namely, for example, ASEAN Japan, it took a while for services to be incorporated, ASEAN India as well. How it all started out was basically a generic reference to the WTO GATS agreement, and basically the GATS was incorporated into the FTA. But over time now, there are individual chapters that are being negotiated or are in the process of being ratified. So the short answer is yes, they all contain elements of trade and services.
Thank you, Ryan. We have another question which is also related to ATISA. So the attendee would like to know that because you mentioned about ATISA, whereby currently there's only 3 ASEAN countries that have ratified it. So before the ATISA ratify, do the company actually refer to AFAS at the moment?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so the answer is yes. Right now, the AFAS is still in force. The AFAS is not, the word is not superseded by the ATISA. Okay, so right now, AFAS is still in force. Take reference from the AFAS in terms of what are the sectors of services commitments. Now, the AFAS 10 package is the latest one. You can refer to that. until at some point in time when the ATISA is fully enforced, I believe MTI will be able to release further information on the status of the agreements. Yeah, but short answer, yes, you can refer to the AFAS at this point.
Okay, thank you, Ryan. I think it's useful to for the businesses to know that they can refer to AFAS at the moment until ATISA is ratified and enter into force. Thank you. My next question is to Eugene. We have a number of questions for you. We have one participant, Carol, who would like to understand how does the AFAS can apply to the telecommunication services to customers in Vietnam?
Yeah, thanks, Ivy. So that's actually a very complicated or complex question, because I think in the AFAS schedule of commitments for Vietnam, the telecommunications services is broken up into essentially basic telecommunications as well as value-added services. And within each of these categories, there are a whole range of subcategories. So I think, Carol, it would be useful to get a sense as to exactly what type of telecommunication services you're looking at. And from there, then we can identify whether or not that particular telecommunications service is covered under the AFAS agreement. And from there, then we take the additional step of comparing it to local regulation in Vietnam to see whether or not AFAS gives you a better result than what's available under domestic regulation today, or whether there are other ways in which AFAS could be of benefit to you.
Thank you, Eugene. We do have another participant, Cynthia. She's asking if she has a website and they are actually doing the B2C, which means that she can actually provide services to anyone around the world who has internet. But how do we actually ensure that we do not face any issues with DTA, should be double tax agreement, because you were mentioning and sharing that the businesses should take note about double tax agreement as well?
Yeah, so I think the whole area of digital tax and how taxes are applied to the digital economy has changed significantly over the last few years and will continue to change because of all these developments in the OECD with the recent G20 and G7 meetings where they're talking about BEPS 2.0 and Pillar 1, Pillar 2 developments. But long story short, I think firstly, if you are a B2C e-commerce provider, then the first thing you need to do is to track where your customers are. So where are the big markets where your customers are? Are they all mainly in Singapore, or whether they are overseas? Now, once you've identified that, of immediate concern to you is to look at where you have significant markets or customers in markets, significant markets overseas. Then to look at whether or not you've complied with the laws, tax laws and regulations of those countries. Typically, the challenge isn't going to come from income tax. It's going to come from more GST, VAT. And there in some countries like Singapore, there is an overseas vendor registration process where if B2C e-commerce providers or e-services providers exceed a certain threshold, they may actually have to register with the local governments to pay their local GST or VAT. In some countries, there's also digital tax, like India, there's the equalization levy and whatnot. But there, I think there are going to be very specific rules as to what you need to do in order to comply with the laws of those countries. And what is important to note is that for many digital tax laws and regulations in various countries which have taken what is commonly known as unilateral measures, the DTAs do not apply. So these local countries have taken the view that their digital tax rules are a treaty override. So in that situation, they're saying these laws will apply regardless of treaty. So I think this whole environment will change, especially with the run-up to the OECD meeting in October. But of immediate concern, I think, look at those few issues that I talked about. Once you've got more data, happy to have a further discussion.
Thank you, Eugene. Okay, I have last one question. It's like, apart from the AFAS, what else does the company needs to think about when doing business overseas? And actually, in your years of experience, do company use AFAS regularly?
Okay. So I think for the ASEAN agreements, I think the usage of the various agreements that deal with trade in goods are a lot better than the usage of the agreements that deal with trade in services, right? And also increasingly, I think there's the use of investment agreements. So AFAS, frankly, is an agreement which is fairly underutilized. And part of the reason is that it's a fairly complex agreement. So just looking at the various slides, which I think Ryan and I have presented on, it doesn't come intuitively to businesses. Unlike tariff reduction, right? You just look at what is the rate and what is reduced, and there you have it. That's the benefit. But I think when we deal with AFAS, it's really moving from the hard and fast reduction of numbers and taxes to looking at very qualitative type of differences. And there you actually need a lot more time to research the rules. So my perception is that not a lot of countries, not a lot of companies have used AFAS in the past. But having said that, I think that just because no one has used it doesn't mean that it's not beneficial. So I think is a challenge. The gauntlet has been thrown down for all of us to look at how we can benefit from these agreements more, and to a certain extent what you're doing here with the SBF and with speakers like Ryan from ESG, etc. I think hopefully you'll promote the usage of AFAS.
Yeah, Ivy, maybe if I can just jump in, a quick response to that.
Sure, thank you.
In fact, from my experience talking to some companies, actually a lot of times it's also recognizing that companies may not be aware that they're already using it. And perhaps the word usage is a bit of a misnomer, because in terms of goods, you can talk about, okay, you apply a tariff reduction. But here, in terms of trade and services, you're talking about the regulations, the restrictions, the climate. And I guess it's like how you recognize that, how do you use protection, for example, right, in the context of investment. Yeah, I think what essentially we are doing, both Singapore government and also private sector, is to ensure that working together within ASEAN, under such a frameworks to ensure business continuity, ensure a level playing field. And insofar as I would say that because markets are open to certain degrees, and the AFAS do accord that level of business certainty, and therefore you on top about usage is in the event where things go south. And I think just now Eugene, Mr. Suan also alluded to that. The level of what you call recourse, for example, right? And I think that's where you have that concept of when you can really use the agreement for recourse. But by and large, if you want to say in a layman terms, actually many of us are already using the agreements without knowing it, by operating in the market with that level playing field.
Thank you. I have one question for one of the hold on. I think I just saw one question that popped up from one of the participants. Is also related to cross-border service. So perhaps either Ryan or Eugene can answer before I ask the next question to Mr. Suan. What are the related taxes or withholding tax on cross-border services within the ASEAN country?
Okay, maybe I'll take this, and Ryan can jump in with additional comments if he's got any. I think with regard to withholding tax, there are two issues to think about. Firstly, to look at whether or not there's a treaty between, say, for example, if you're Singapore and the country where you're providing services to, whether there's a treaty between the two countries that deal with withholding tax. So withholding taxes typically apply to dividends, interest, royalties. In some situations, country may also have taxes on services, service fees. But generally, I think in most countries, if you're sort of B2C kind of provider of services, then where there's a treaty, and I think Singapore has an extensive treaty network, then in those countries, in many of the treaties, the position is that if you do not have a permanent establishment overseas in the foreign country, there should be no tax that applies. So there's no P, no tax provision. So that would help deal with a lot of countries where Singapore has a treaty and where the P protection provision states a no P, no tax provision. Now, if in countries where there is no treaty, then you need to look at the domestic law to determine what are the applicable withholding taxes. Typically, if there is a withholding tax that applies, then the alternative is to ensure that you can take credit in Singapore.
Thank you, Eugene. Okay, so now I shall invite Mr. Suan. We have a question from one of the participants. How can actually SME prepare themselves in their digital capabilities to capture the growth opportunities in the growing digital economy?
Okay, sure. Thanks, Ivy. Okay, so I have this question here on from SME about preparing themselves. So there are two parts. One is the digitalization, right, I believe, and also the other one is the regional opportunities. I'm not sure the background of the company, any particular company of this company, but in general, the way I look at it is that there are a couple of ways to handle to solve these pain points, so to speak. In terms of digitalization, I believe I think organizations, Singapore government itself already providing quite a bit of support for companies going on the digitalization route. Okay, for instance, I think maybe Ryan can jump in here. I think the SME centers, the various SME centers are available to help in this particular area. I'm not sure if I'm correct here in terms of digitalization, right? And even private organizations or private companies, like for instance, banks, also participate in these digitalization efforts as well. For instance, I think UOB, I understand that in terms of inventory, HR, payment processing and things like that, I think the bank, UOB, also provides services to support companies on these digitalization capabilities, to upgrade the digitalization opportunities. The second part about going to regional opportunities, capturing regional opportunities, I believe, I think we are in the right place here. I think SBF, right, the TNCs, trade associations and chambers also have outreach or resources available to help our SMEs to reach out to the markets that you want, to the segments that you want. They have resources to provide you with that context. Again, I think like banks, like UOB also, because of our customer presence in these various countries, so through our contacts as well, we also support our clients to reach out to these markets as well, to look for opportunities, to look for contacts, to look for network, etc. So there are a couple of ways to help, and I think a lot of help is available, right? I think Ivy or Ryan, you might want to add to my incomplete answers.
Thank you, Mr. Suan. Yes, you're absolutely right. I think the first port of call is the SME sectors. Yeah, and definitely SBF, ESG. ESG also has departments looking at digitalization. Also work with DISG, Digitalization Office in Singapore. So I guess there are a lot of help available, especially by SME. But I guess if you don't know where to start with the SME centers. Yeah, then we can divert internally, no issues.
Thank you, Mr. Suan. Thank you, Ryan. As time is also running up, I will pose my last question to Ying regarding ASEAN Online Sale Day. There's one question on the businesses would like to understand. Are they able to sell their product and services on the ASEAN Online Sale Day website, or actually they can decide their own discounts and promotion on their own website?
Thanks, Ivy. So to respond to that question on whether businesses are able to sell products and services over the official AOSD website, so the answer is that, okay, how the AOSD website works is that it will collate the websites and logos of participating businesses, and then links will be embedded in the icons. So a consumer, if they want to shop, they will press on the link and they'll be directed to the company. So there will be no transactions that take place on the AOSD website itself. And to the second part of the question, yes, definitely, businesses can choose their own discount promotions and what items will be on sale. So that is definitely up for the respective businesses to decide.
Thank you very much, Ying. It's very clear right now. Thank you. I would like to say thank you to all the speakers for taking time out to join us in this morning. And then I also want to say thank you to all the attendees for joining us this morning too. So before you guys leave, please kindly remember to fill up the end of the webinar and provide feedback to us so that we can further improve our events. Once again, thank you very much. Have a good week ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, everyone.